America Trends Podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.
What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. I'm Larry Rifkin. Let's see a show of hands. Recycling is a good thing. Oh, yeah, I guess we all agree. But only if we do it right. Otherwise, we pollute the recycling stream, and the economic value for towns and cities not only goes down, but they begin to have to pay to recycle. We need more education as it relates to the confusing numbers regarding plastics. The mantra has been reduce, reuse, recycle, and that's been around for a long time. And if you do the first two things, you'll be required to do a lot less recycling. In a time of the stay-at-home economy, we have more packages to break down and recycle. I hope you'll admit we can all use a refresher course on the importance and the best way to recycle. That's what we offer you today on America Trends.
With me on America Trends is Jenny Romer, and she's written a book about recycling called Can I Recycle This? A Guide to Better Recycling. And Jenny, I want to talk to you in the micro sense and also in the macro sense of recycling. And let me start off by asking you about the whole idea of reducing, reusing, and recycling. You talk about it in your book. Now, this was a 1970s mantra. It's still true today. And you say that reducing and reusing are more important than actually the recycling portion.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. So with recycling, you're really avoiding some of the issues with using an item, with using packaging. You're avoiding the extraction and you're avoiding kind of the end of life, like disposal issues. But there still are issues of transportation, remanufacturing, and all of that can be avoided if you just don't get an item in the first place or reuse. And that's something that's really gotten lost, and that's really not by mistake. The plastics industry in particular has spent a lot of money on marketing recycling as the answer so people can continue to keep using single-use plastic without really thinking too much about it. And what I try to get into in my book is really how recycling really works. But a lot of single-use plastic isn't actually being recycled into another item right now.
And do we have the misimpression that it is? When we put things out at the curb, I think there's a sense that it's going to go for a better and a reuse purpose, but that's not nearly always the case.
Right. I think a lot of people get a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling when they put things in their recycling bin, feel like they're, doing a really good thing. And, I'm not telling people to stop doing that. Keep doing it for sure. But also, to pay more attention when you're at the store to buy things that are maybe made of recycled content and that are truly recyclable, and to avoid the things that are the single-use plastic and other things that we don't really need. So my book looks at not just what you can put in your recycling bin, because that's really up to local jurisdictions, depends on the recycling philosophy and what machinery they have. But I look past that to what the average sorting machinery looks like and what it's capable of sorting, and then also the commodities market, because recycling is based on a global commodities market where all the materials are put into bales. So you'll have a bale that's just made up of one particular type of material, and it's sold on the global commodities market. But if there's no one who wants to buy that bale of material, then it's just going to go to landfill or maybe be incinerated. And so people don't really think about that. They just kind of think if they put it in their bin that it'll all get figured out on the other end.
Well, we lost the Chinese market for plastic, for example, several years ago, as well as some kinds of cardboard, paper, and glass. And that, according to a lot of reports, really upended the U.S. recycling industry. What kind of blow was that? And are we now forming our own industry? Because now we have all gotten into the habit of recycling. Maybe we're not always the best at it, or maybe we have aspirational recycling where we put things in that are not really recyclable, but we think they are, or we're too lazy to find out. But tell me, what is the market like today?
Sometimes there's too much blame on the consumers ourselves. Part of the problem is people not sorting correctly, but a lot of the problem is that a lot of this material isn't valuable in the first place. So even if it is sorted correctly, it's not ultimately going to find that buyer. And so that's a big problem that's been happening when China shut their door to our low value plastics in particular, was that we no longer had a reliable place that we could ship those low-value plastics and get money for it. Municipal recycling was a moneymaker for a long time and still is with some materials, particularly things like aluminum cans and some plastics like milk jugs, which are made out of HDPE plastic. That's resin number 2 that's inside the little chasing arrow symbol. That really still has value. It's worth nearly $1,000 a ton on the commodities market. Whereas other plastics, like we call them 3 through 7s, they have those are the numbers that are in the chasing arrow symbols. Those are worth about negative $20 a ton, meaning that you have to pay someone to haul them away. And so what happened when China shut the door there, China said we're not going to take any contaminated bales of plastic anymore. We no longer had someone willing to pay for it. And with China, because of the trade deficit, they were able to get a lot of our low-value plastics without really having to pay high shipping costs. A lot of shipping containers were going back empty to China anyway. So that's why China was particularly important, because of that trade deficit and because it was just such a huge market of family farms turned into plastic processing facilities. But I think it's a good thing overall, because now we're really talking about what happened there. People just kind of, thought, oh, good, it's recycling for a long time. But it turned out that really there was a lot of pollution that was being caused in China because after that material was processed, a lot of the time it was just dumped in the environment or burned. And that's really not what we want, what we expect when we think of recycling.
When we think about U.S. processing facilities and the municipalities that we all live in, they have either had to pay more to recycle or simply discard the waste. I looked it up, and in 2017, for example, in Stamford, Connecticut, I live in Connecticut, they had made $95,000 by selling recyclables. In 2018, it had to pay $700,000 to have them removed. So what has that meant? Do we have fewer recycling programs? Are towns and municipalities cutting back? What have we seen across the country?
First of all, I'm really impressed with your research and those numbers. That's really interesting. I'm not surprised there. Yeah, so municipalities are having to pay to have this material hauled away now, or some municipalities are moving towards only accepting the recyclables that they know they have a market for. So some places are switching to, from collecting something like all rigid plastics to instead only collecting bottles and jugs that are made out of plastic number 1 or number 2, because they know that there's a strong market for those. And, that can be good because there's more transparency that way. So customers think, or consumers think, oh, these are the things that I can recycle. Whereas now, I think a lot of people will just put whatever is plastic in their bin. The calculation by a lot of the municipalities, so there's some, like including New York City, have a philosophy that if they accept everything, if they accept all rigid plastic, that they will get more overall and they can sort through it and get the valuable stuff. But I think what we really need to see is extended producer responsibility law for packaging. So that means, we call them EPR laws, and they're pending in 10 states right now. That really would shift financial responsibility to the manufacturers of all this packaging. And if they're responsible for the cost of recycling and disposal and cleanup of all of this packaging that's not really being recycled, then I think we would see a shift towards packaging that is recyclable, more sustainable, source reduced, and hopefully we would see more of a domestic market for the processing rather than what we were relying on before was shipping a lot of our low value plastics abroad.
What about a federal policy related to recycling? It seems as if it's rather ad hoc and that it is based on municipalities. Some are doing a great job and they have a zero waste goal like San Francisco, and others are a little more casual about it. I'm sure there are some that do very little, if anything, and make it a private concern. Do we need a federal policy related to recycling? And where does recycling fit into the environmental concerns that surround us today, like climate change?
Yeah, I'm happy that you brought up federal legislation. I've been spending quite a bit of time on the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which is a federal bill that was introduced last year and was just recently reintroduced by Congressmember Lowenthal and Senator Merkley. It was originally introduced by Udall in the Senate, but he retired. And that bill is really a comprehensive look at plastics policy and recycling. And, it covers other materials as well, but really the focus is plastics, and it deals with everything from the production of plastic to put a moratorium on new permits for plastic production facilities because we really have a glut in the market right now. And then includes a lot of the laws that we see around the country, like a bag law, a foam foodware ban, and then it includes what I was talking about, the extended producer responsibility, where manufacturers would be responsible for the recycling, the cost of the recycling of all of this packaging, and it puts a ban on shipment of low-value plastic to developing countries. And there's a whole lot more included in there, including a national beverage container law, and really defining what recycling means in a more strict way. Because there's also movement at the federal level by the plastics industry to define recycling very broadly, to include incineration and to allow for kind of what they call plastic to fuel technology, or what they call chemical recycling sometimes, which is kind of melting down a lot of that low value plastic and then burning it later. And those are things that, from my perspective, those should never be called recycling. So we want to make sure that we're defining what that means really strongly. So, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is something that, was just introduced last year, but this session has over 100 co-sponsors. So, it's something that is being taken seriously in the legislature. And I think, we wouldn't be here if we hadn't been really talking about single-use plastics and passing those state and local policies for over a decade now. And now it's really getting attention at the federal level. But there's also, the plastics industry, the American Chemistry Council have a huge presence in D.C. And so, that'd be a big fight to push that law through.
So, Jenny, is it fair to say that we haven't had a federal policy? We still don't until legislation is put forward. But how well are we, Americans, at understanding really what happens to a bottle or a can or something that we call recyclable? How well do we understand the process? Because some years ago, and not that long ago, we had town dumps, and just about everything was thrown into a landfill. And we still have some of that. Just explain to us what the processes are that do go on with any of the things, say the things we put in our garbage versus the things generally we put in our recyclables.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that Americans really don't know very much about what happens after things are put in their garbage and recycling bins. And, I think that we live in a pretty sanitized society. We don't really think about our trash, but I think it's fascinating. I always have. And so I think, taking advantage of if your jurisdiction allows, or maybe doesn't allow now, but might in the future, tours at the local recycling facility. I think it's a really great opportunity to see how everything works, and there are also some YouTube videos online, but I'll walk you through it now. So with your trash can, that is going to be picked up. A lot of the time it'll be picked up by different trucks. So the trash can, everything will just go into one place, be compacted, and then brought to your local, or a lot of the time not local, to a landfill that might be in your area, might be far away, or it might be brought to an incinerator. And with that, no one's going to go through your trash and pick out the recyclables in the vast majority of jurisdictions. So that's all going to go to one place. Then for your recycling, some communities have a dual bin system where they'll put everything, all the paper will go in one bin, the metal, glass, and plastic will go in another bin. And some jurisdictions have one single bin. And that a lot of time depends on, again, the philosophy and what machinery they have available. Some places think that if you put everything in one bin, you'll recycle more overall, but things will get a little bit more dirty, especially the paper. And so when you get to a recycling facility, particularly the metal, glass, plastic facilities, there's pretty big variation as far as what that machinery looks like. In my book, I walk people through the Sims Municipal Facility in New York City. That's one of the more state-of-the-art facilities, and so everything gets kind of put onto a conveyor belt and then makes its way through a lot of different machinery. So it'll go through various screens where the small things will kind of fall through, and so things like bottle caps and forks and straws will fall through along with glass, and that a lot of the time will end up as residue, meaning that it's going to go to landfill for those little tiny items. And then it'll go through magnets, electrical fields, and what I think is the coolest thing are cameras, which I like to think of as lasers that can tell what type of plastic a container is made out of, and then use an air gun to shoot that bottle or container into a particular bin, sorted by the type of plastic. A lot of the time it's just the higher value plastics that are being sorted out. And then those bins, when there's enough in a bin, it will be compressed into a bale, and that bale is then sold on the commodities market. And so, that's one step I try to let people know about that process, because then they can think a lot more about what will happen to their item after they put it in the bin. And then the next step is the commodities market, and how much a bale sells for is based on what type of material the bale is made out of. So aluminum cans will sell for a whole lot. Tin steel cans will sell for quite a bit less. And then plastics also is generally baled, number one plastic, number two plastic, and then majority of jurisdictions will bale everything else together into a 3 through 7 bale, and that's considered low value plastic and sells for very little, if anything at all.
You tell us that the hardest products to reuse are the plastics. Only 9% of plastics has been recycled. What happens to the rest of it, and how important is it for us to get away from a lot of these plastics?
Yeah, a lot of it would go to incineration or landfill, majority of it landfill. And, prior to China closing its doors to our low-value plastics, a lot of it was being shipped to China. Now some of it's going to other countries that are willing to accept it now, that a lot of them have even less infrastructure than China did. There's also a movement internationally to stop the flow of low-value plastics to particularly to developing countries. There's a treaty called the Basel Treaty, where that dealt with hazardous waste, and there was an amendment added on, the Plastics Amendment, a couple of years ago, that made it so countries would not ship their low-value plastics to developing countries. The U.S. has not signed on to that, so we are not bound by it, but there are a few companies, including Waste Management, the biggest waste management hauler company in the U.S., has said that they're not going to be shipping their low value plastics abroad. That's something that we're really keeping an eye on, because, I see plastics and recycling not just as an environmental issue, but also a humanitarian issue. And when we're shipping our low value plastics abroad, not only are we contaminating the environment abroad, but also causing a lot of human health and quality of life issues.
When you look at laws, regulations, education, technology, financial carrots and sticks, what do you find are the most appropriate ways to change behaviors, either on the part of manufacturers or consumers?
Yeah, so my background, I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer with the Surfrider Foundation, and I, originally got into plastics policy work because I was interested in plastic bag laws, and I founded a website about plastic bag laws when I was in San Francisco 10 years ago. And I did that in part because I saw that the mechanism for reducing plastic bag litter and consumption was putting a fee on plastic bags. And I wanted to share that information. And the plastics industry was suing a lot of local jurisdictions at that time who went forward with adopting plastic bag laws. And so I've spent a whole lot of time, I'd say over a decade, on researching the effectiveness of various local plastic bag laws that have been adopted. So, we know what mechanisms work there. It could be a ban, but it always has to have a monetary component to really encourage people to bring their own bags and avoid just getting new carry-out bags when they're at the store. So that's one thing. But, various products and packaging, different types of mechanisms work. We've seen that bottle deposits work well for getting bottles to be returned, but I would like to see those bottles be refilled and reused rather than just recycled after they're returned. And I highlight a pilot project for that in Oregon in my book. And then with, getting beyond the single items, what we're really talking about policy-wise now is EPR, extended producer responsibility, where producers are having to pay into a system, into a fund basically, to pay for recycling and waste disposal, and they pay less into that fund if their products are more readily recyclable, if their products are made of recycled content, if their products are reusable and refillable and actually have a system where things could be reused and refilled. So, we started off 10 years ago with more basic policies aimed at particular items, and we're still working on that. I just released a map at Surfrider of 1,000 laws that are U.S. bag, foam, foodware, and straw laws. So we're still seeing a lot of that at the local level, but we're moving on to not just those items, but to the packaged goods that we see on the grocery store shelves that really contribute a lot to that non-recyclable, low-value plastics.
During the pandemic, we have had so much delivery coming to our homes and so much package that comes with it, and people breaking up the boxes and putting it out at the curb. Has that created a new thrust or a new way of looking at the way that we are actually packaging items, given that there's so much delivery now involved?
Yeah, the delivery space is somewhere where we really have so much work to do. As far as those, delivery envelopes, most of the delivery packaging is not recyclable. Those plastic delivery envelopes are not recyclable curbside. Any kind of plastic film is considered a tangler in the vast majority of curbside programs. So don't wish cycle those. Cardboard and paper are recyclable, but they're being used in just really high volumes now that so many people are getting delivery rather than going to in person to a store. But the food delivery is definitely a big problem as well. A lot of the food delivery containers are not recyclable. They're made out of, the plastic ones tend to be made out of a material called thermoform. And so that's still the same type of plastic resin. It's just made a different way where the polymer chains, some people describe it as a polymer chain being weaker, the molecular weight being less, just to get a little bit wonky. But there's work to do as far as recycling those versus the bottles and jugs are valuable, but those thermoforms that the food containers are made out of are really not valuable on the market right now. So unfortunately, a lot of those are going to landfill. Another thing that is more easily avoidable are the utensils. Plastic utensils are not recyclable. They're awkwardly shaped and usually made out of a resin that's not recyclable. But that's something where, I'm working on legislation. Particularly, we have legislation at New York City Council right now to make utensils and condiments upon request. And that's something that, should be a common sense thing that saves restaurants money and makes it so consumers have less stuff that they are, cluttering their drawers or throwing away or recycling.
Yes, sometimes these restaurateurs just throw in tons of them. There was a recent Greenpeace report that found that the PET, the number ones, or the HDPE number 2 plastic bottles are the only types of plastic that are truly recyclable in the U.S. today, and yet only 29% of the PET bottles are collected for recycling, and of those, only 21% of the bottles are actually made into recycled materials due to contamination. What are we as Americans best at recycling, and what do we understand the least about the process, or that gets the most hits as being contaminated and thus the least attractive for somebody on the commodities market?
Yeah, I think we're relatively good at recycling paper and cardboard, but even with that, there are issues with contamination. So with those paperboard containers that some takeout food comes in, or even our coffee cups, those generally are not recyclable. And because of the coatings that they have and because they're made out of short paper fibers, we really need to have long paper fibers to be made into new paper. And so if you throw away your coffee cup into a paper recycling bin, particularly if there's, half a latte still in it, you're really hindering the recycling system rather than helping it. So that's something that I think people need to pay more attention to, is making sure that you're cleaning out all of your recyclables before putting them into your bin. But like I said, a lot of it is, it's not just us. I think we need to do the best that we can as consumers as far as making sure that we're cleaning out the materials, making sure that we're only giving the recycling facilities the things that they're asking for. So look at your local rules is one of my number one take-homes. But also that we need to change the system overall to make it so that we're not getting as much low-value plastics in the first place. And I think a couple other things that we shouldn't, as warnings, that we shouldn't be putting in our bins, but we definitely don't want to wish cycle, are things like plastic bags and plastic films, because those tangle the machinery and cost your local facilities money because they have to shut down the whole line and cut out that material. Some people even recycle things like garden hoses and old clothing. Those are going to tangle the machinery as well and definitely will not have a market. Those are going to go to landfill. And then batteries, particularly rechargeable batteries or any kind of electronic that has a rechargeable battery in it. Those batteries cause explosions and fires at recycling facilities and in trucks when they're getting jumbled around. So much so that some facilities are having a hard time finding insurance. That's a pretty big deal. So another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, the discarding has a title of non-recyclable items, aspirational or wishful recycling, and that may be that you just want to get it out of your home, but that's not just the best way to do it, just to put it out there and hope. I mean, string lights and garden hoses and dirty diapers and all of that. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you about the difference between, say, urban areas and suburban areas in terms of our rate of recycling, and it's really difficult. I remember doing an interview with a recycling coordinator in a local community in Connecticut. And it's just a whole nother set of experiences if you're living on the third floor versus having a single family home. What do we find about the differential there and the way that communities are helping those individuals to be better, providers of the right content in terms of recycling?
Yeah, I mean, generally we see at single-family homes better sorting of recycling, and that makes some sense, because if people are living in, an apartment building and there's a big communal area with recycling and trash cans, that there is less kind of personal responsibility there. You don't really know who is doing what, a lot less, a really effective sorting. In some places, you'll get a ticket for improper sorting, depending on, in some cities. And so, that's a mechanism where the super for that building might start paying a whole lot more attention if there's a ticket involved. But, that's the stick. There's also carrots of some jurisdictions are, spending the time to have recycling coordinators come out and talk to people about recycling, and helping with the sorting, or even putting a kind of a sticker on the bin saying, "Great job," if there are bins that have been sorted really well. But yeah, if we're seeing some more emphasis by local jurisdictions to have coordinators that are more involved in the community.
Yeah, I see that as well around here. What about single stream versus dual stream in terms of what that does for the actual percentage of people who recycle? And maybe it's best if you tell us what percentage of people in the United States, because I think our consumption has gone up over the years, thus our need to get rid of stuff has gone up as well. But what percentage don't recycle at all?
Yeah, I don't have that number in front of me, but it's a relatively large number of people that are not recycling at all. And I think that's in part because some people just don't think that it works. And one bad part about about China closing its door to our low value recycling is that with some people have really gotten the idea that recycling doesn't work at all. Recycling is complicated and nuanced, and that a lot of the time doesn't get communicated. And so people hear that there's an issue with recycling, and some people think, there's no point. And one thing that I try to get across in my book is, it's illustrated. I try to make it as fun, to, get a lot of these bigger concepts across, but it's also pretty to let people know that, it's not that recycling doesn't work. It's not that we don't know what's happening. We know it's happening, but it's complicated, and it will take a lot of effort to really get it on the right track. But I'm hoping that as we move forward with that more people engage in the recycling process.
When you hear the conversation that is going on in America about our need to refurbish our infrastructure, I'm sure as somebody who really deals with recycling and plastics and such, you have your hand raised saying, don't forget about us. I know we have a lot of sophisticated facilities, but then again, we still have some old-fashioned landfills, and we could try to go into waste to energy and all of that, but it gets very, very complicated and in the weeds. But having said that, what about our infrastructure, and are we thinking about waste? We hear about water, we hear about transit, but we don't hear a lot about waste.
Yeah, so I'm involved in the Break Free from Plastic movement, which is a global movement to reduce single-use plastics. Surfrider's a member, and we put together a presidential action plan with proposed executive orders on reducing plastic and addressing it with recycling. And we also put together asks, budget asks, including new infrastructure for recycling. And so, yeah, that's something that we're definitely trying to get out in front of, and make sure that there is funding going towards infrastructure for recycling. But we want to make sure that, kind of like you said, it's the infrastructure is for really effective recycling, and I think, and also domestic manufacturing, remanufacturing, so that we're processing the materials here rather than sending them abroad. But we do not want that money to go towards waste to energy or unproven plastic to fuel technologies. And right now, the plastics industry is really pushing hard on kind of reclassifying some projects to be manufacturing rather than solid waste in quite a few states, just to try to fund a lot of these unproven technologies. So I'm having to spend some time pushing back on that as well. And so really knowing the details of what kind of recycling should be as far as mechanical recycling versus what being pushed as waste to energy and other things like that.
Jenny, in closing, you reminded us at the beginning that we should reduce and reuse, and then recycle is the last part of the mantra. But you also tell us in your book that we need to have personal solutions and bring your own everything. I mean, for somebody who really wants to be as conscious as they can, but they're busy doing other things, they have to accept the fact that many of the consumer products in America are packaged in whatever way they're packaged at the moment. And again, you want to bring the manufacturers more into this process at the beginning, which would help us all. Then we don't have to make a lot of these personal decisions. But for the moment, what would you say to somebody listening who obviously is educated and is thoughtful in this process because they've listened to all of this podcast? So when they want to answer the question, can I recycle this, what other questions should they ask themselves?
Maybe what can I bring with me is another question. So, I talk about bringing your own bag and then getting beyond that to maybe bringing your own water bottle, bringing your own coffee cup. Like I said, coffee cups aren't really being recycled, and even bringing your own utensils. And so doing things like if you work when we, get back into working in offices again, I used when I worked at a corporate law firm for a long time, I had my own set of utensils at my desk rather than getting a new set of utensils with every meal, like most of my colleagues did. But that really, even doing things like that, or bringing your own, cup to an event where everyone's going to have a plastic cup. Those are conversation starters. And so those might seem like really small things, but they can change the narrative a little bit. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind. 10 years ago, it wasn't very common for people to bring their own reusable bag in a lot of places. But now that's something that we see as pretty common. And so, there is a personal part to this as well, to the reuse and reduction. So, I don't think not everyone's going to be perfect, but finding those things that you can do and fit into your life, I think are helpful. And then, like you said, I really push for policy as well.
One other question. Connecticut likes to call itself the pizza state now, and pizza boxes. There are so many of them. And so tell us, finally, let's have an authority. What should you do with a pizza box?
I don't know if New York might be a contentious fight for who the pizza state is. But,
I know, and New Jersey. Yeah.
Yes, true. So in my book, there's one of the spreads is about pizza boxes. And as a general rule, cardboard is very recyclable, but once it gets contaminated with food, particularly pizza grease, that makes it not recyclable. So it really depends on the level of grease in your box, in your pizza box. So sometimes the grease, the little piece of paper, wax paper that's usually under your pizza, that might catch everything, and then that whole box could be recyclable as long as you take all the food out. Other times the grease might infiltrate the bottom of the box, and you might just have to rip off the top and only recycle the top. But I have a nice illustration of that in the book. There are some jurisdictions that are willing to accept more grease than others. I talked with Pratt Recycling in New York City, and they said, just give us all of your boxes, even if they're greasy. So check with your local jurisdiction. Most of them will only take your pizza box if it doesn't have any grease on it at all.
Okay. Jenny Romer, let's also give a shout out to the illustrator of this wonderful book, Christy Young. And again, for some of the younger people in the audience or someone that you want to make certain that the future is a little bit better than what we've done thus far with recycling, this would be a great gift. Can I Recycle This? A guide to better recycling and how to reduce single-use plastics. A real expert in this area has been our guest, Jenny Romer. And Jenny, I thank you so much. If anybody wants to get involved with any of the causes that you've mentioned today, how can they do that?
Sure. I invite you to check out my website, canirecyclethisbook.com. Also, as I mentioned, I'm a legal associate at the Surfrider Foundation. plastic pollution initiatives. So you can go to surfrider.org and look at all of our plastics work.
Jenny, thanks so much. We really appreciate it for you guesting with us today on America Trends.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
You too.